welcome to the webinar for the Institute of Medicine report titled Public Implications of Raising the Minimum Age of Legal Access to Tobacco Products. Today by speakers from our study committee, including Mr. Richard Bonney, Committee Chair and Harrison Foundation Professor of Medicine and Law and Director of the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Dr. Lance, who is Professor and Chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at George Washington University's Milken Institute of Public Health. Dr. Robin Mermelstein, she is Professor of Psychology and Director of the Institute for Health Research and Policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Last, we have Dr. Rafael Meza, a professor in the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Just rules before we get started. The audio for today's event will be streamed through your computer speakers. We will be taking questions through the Q&A box located in the lower right-hand side of your screen. So you simply type your question in the box and click send. We ask that you include your full name and affiliation with your submitted question. Also, the webinar is being recorded. Any questions you submit may be read aloud and included in our recording. To the recording, as well as a copy of the slides posted on our website within the next week or so. If you have technical issues during the event, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Again, 1-866-229-3239. And we'd like to turn things over to Richard Bonney, who will give an overview of the report's findings. Richard and the other committee members will take your questions. Richard?
It's a pleasure to present this report on behalf of the Institute of Medicine and particularly of an outstanding committee that wrote it. I want to emphasize, as I'm sure everyone knows, that Academy reports are consistent report and represent the collective judgment of the members of the committee. So let me try to begin the presentation by putting the inquiry that was undertaken in context of the nation's 50-year public health campaign to reduce tobacco use. As everyone knows, the backbone of these efforts since the 1970s has been comprehensive state and local tobacco control, and we expect that to continue. However, federal actions and scientific reports by the Surgeon General and the National Academies have played an important role in history, and especially in relation to initiation of tobacco smoking by youth. And it is worth remembering the tremendous focus that was placed on this topic in the early 1980s with the SINAR Amendment, a Surgeon General's report, an IOM report in 1994, and then the important initiative by the FDA in 1995, leading the 1996 tobacco rule, focused on a comprehensive effort on reducing youth initiation. Fortunately, of course, that report was invalidated by the Supreme Court in 2000. However, obviously an important step in tobacco control then occurred in 2009 with the enactment of the Tobacco Act, as I will call it. The Act gave FDA broad authority over tobacco products, including directing the FDA to reissue the 1996 tobacco rule relating to youth and advertising restrictions. Federal law set the minimum age for legal access, as the original rule had done, at 18. One of the few restrictions that was imposed on the FDA in the Tobacco Control Act was that the FDA does not have the authority to raise the minimum age to a level higher than 18. The Act also, however, provided that the FDA should convene an expert panel to study the public implications of raising the minimum age to purchase tobacco products and to submit a report to Congress. And this is that study. We delivered it to the FDA a couple of days ago, and obviously the FDA will then determine how it will transmit the report to the Congress. We're happy to present now to the field in general, and particularly to those who might influence state and local activities. The statement of task for the committee was to examine the existing literature on tobacco control, tobacco use initiation, and using various methods, including modeling, to predict likely public health outcomes of raising the minimum age for purchase of tobacco products to 19, 20, and 25. It's so important to emphasize that the report includes only conclusions about the likely public health implications of raising the minimum age, and no recommendation as to whether the age should be raised at the request of FDA. One comment about the vocabulary in the report. I think people who have been in this field know there's a consistency in the way the minimum age is referred to in discussion. Sometimes referred to as the minimum age of sale, which obviously by its nature focuses on the seller, and the minimum age of purchase, which by its nature focuses on the purchaser. That has important symbolic importance, and it could have important legal importance as well. The Act itself actually uses both phrases, minimum purchase age and minimum sale age. The committee decided to use a more neutral term and referred to the minimum age as the minimum age of legal access, and therefore uses the acronym MLA. It's one of the reasons for doing that is that the laws and enforcement policies in the states vary considerably, and that many of them prohibit possession and use as well as sale. A few do not. There are variations also in enforcement. And given that variation, it seemed like a more neutral characterization made sense. By what I think to most people listening, 1 in 5 high school seniors is a current cigarette smoker, with 1 in 3 young adults. Among adults who have ever smoked daily, nearly 90% reported having first tried a cigarette and become smokers before 19, and nearly everyone that becomes a smoker as an adult did so before the age of 26. Although earlier age of initiation is associated with greater levels of nicotine dependence, and the earlier the age of onset, the greater the intensity and persistence of smoking beyond adolescence into young adulthood. The committee spent considerable effort reviewing the literature, the recent literature on adolescent development and the development of young adults. As will be indicated later, those influenced the committee's findings. Suggest that adolescent brains, because of their level of development, are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of nicotine and nicotine addiction. And the period from adolescence through young adulthood is one of continuous development. It involves both increasing level of psychosocial maturity and the ability to control behavior, but there are no specific age markers. And from a developmental standpoint, for example, there's nothing magic about the age of 18. Developmental trajectories in adolescents and young adults, of course, can be affected by the environment and by differences in exposure to and motivations that may affect motivations to use tobacco. Briefly of the current status of the minimum legal access, age of legal access to tobacco. As I've noted, federal law requires a minimum age of 18. 46 states have set the age at 18. However, 4 states have it at 19. As I think we're all aware, localities including New York City and several dozen small towns and the Big Island in Hawaii have raised it to 21. All these states and prohibit distribution of tobacco to underage persons. All of them prohibit commercial transfers. However, 48 states and the district also prohibit non-commercial transfers, such as giving, exchanging, bartering, furnishing of tobacco, even if not for commercial purposes. 44 states and the district prohibit purchase, use, and possession. The remaining states do not. With regard to the literature on enforcement, this is actually a fairly extensive literature on enforcement. Based on the committee's review, it's important to emphasize, of course, the SINAR program requires states to enact and enforce laws prohibiting sale or distribution of tobacco to young under 18 upon pain of losing their substance abuse and treatment block grants. FDA provides funding to state partners to conduct compliance checks, specifically for enforcement purposes. There are restrictions against internet sales. However, they are weakly enforced. Tobacco products are relatively easily available to underage individuals online. There's little evidence that underage persons are obtaining tobacco from an illegal market, and the committee also, in considering that, doesn't think that such a market is likely to arise to serve underage purchase. That also is congruent with a finding made by another IOM committee recently as well, IOM NRC committee. In addition, there's evidence that bans on these non-commercial distributions of tobacco by friends or proxy purchasers are being enforced. In the context of what I've just said, I think we're all also aware of the data repeatedly in studies of high school students and youth that people who are under 18 largely get tobacco from so-called social sources, indicated here in the highlighted in the bold in this table. The proportion of responses that I bought a pack of cigarettes myself is obviously greater, goes up significantly at the age of 18, as would be expected, and the figures in terms of the percentage of times young people younger than 18 were able to buy a packet themselves, particularly the older teenagers, more or less conform to the data with regard to compliance checks as well. The literature with regard to enforcement, 3 points should be made. One is that based on the available literature, it's clear that active enforcement of the minimum age restrictions decrease the availability of retail tobacco to underage persons. But the magnitude of this effect and impact on underage consumption are uncertain to the continued availability of tobacco from non-commercial sources. We believe that the availability from non-commercial or social sources is incomplete and doesn't provide a full replacement for or full substitution for what would be available if there were availability from retail distributors. The level of substitution by social sources is likely to be lowest for the youngest underage users. And underage tobacco use is most substantially reduced when the jurisdiction adopts a strong array of tobacco control measures, including strongly enforced youth access restrictions. The order to carry out its charge, had to make to estimate what the consequences of raising the minimum age would be, had to make a set of assumptions about enforcement under the higher minimum age. As probably behooves any forecasting effort, we made what we think is a set of conservative assumptions. So identify them. First, levels of enforcement and retailer clients with the youth access laws will remain at levels similar to those that currently exist, and that the same level of enforcement that is occurring now for under 18 would also apply to 19 or 18 if it were raised to 19, or 18, 19, and 20 if it were raised to 21. If it were raised to 25, the committee is actually a little less certain about whether that assumption would be warranted, and therefore, actually, in some of the modeling assumptions, we a bit wide amplitude of the estimates there. Secondly, social and other non-commercial sources of tobacco products will remain essentially as they are now, and no new efforts will be made to enforce minimum age restrictions against social sources. Now, again, a conservative assumption, and obviously that could be strengthened. Sanctions will be directed, as they are now, primarily toward retailers and not toward individual users. Basically, with all those assumptions in mind, expect that raising the minimum age will reduce youth access to tobacco products through the reduction of retail availability and the probability that non-smoking youth will have social contact and networks that contain smokers. In addition, change in the minimum age also will to reinforce the anti-smoking social norm and probably strengthen that norm the higher the age would be set. So those would be the mechanisms by which raising the minimum age could be expected to affect youth initiation. With all that in mind, including those assumptions, let me begin to report the findings of the study. First of all, as implied in what I just said, increasing the minimum age will prevent or delay initiation of tobacco use by adolescents and young adults. The degree to which it will do so and the magnitude of the increase will naturally depend upon whether the age is raised to 19, 21, or 25. The on initiation of raising, I'm skipping to conclusion 3, impact of raising the age to 21 will likely be substantially higher than raising it to 19. The added effect of raising the age beyond 21 to 25 will be considerably smaller. Conclusion 7.2, although the changes in the minimum age will directly pertain naturally to young people who are age 18 or older, depending upon where the minimum age is set, the largest proportionate reduction in initiation of tobacco use will likely occur among adolescents 15 to 17. So what the committee process in relation to the efforts to quantify those overall conclusions that I just mentioned. It was, as I said earlier, a consensus process. With regard to, and I'll present this in two parts, right now pertaining to the estimated effects of raising the age on initiation. We characterized the likely impact on initiation in 3 qualitative descriptors, small, medium, and large, and considered possible changes in initiation rates according to differences in age. Under 15, between 15 and 17, and at age 18 if the minimum age were raised only to 19, ages 18 to 20 if it were raised to 21 or 25, and then ages 21 to 24 if the minimum age were set at 25. of subsequent slides, which I will just walk through so that you can get an overview of them, but they're quite busy slides. We present the estimated increase, the increase in the small, medium, and large categories according to 19, 21, and 25, reading the graph from left to right. This is the one with regard to young people less than 15. Among the factors taken into account in making these estimates include the developmental stage and vulnerability of the young person at the relevant ages, the exposure to social networks that include smokers, the so-called social sources, and thirdly, impact of raising the minimum age on the reinforcing the social norm and the way in which that might affect the different categories of young people. So here you have age 15, ages 15 to 17. Here that we just based on the observing the slide, we think the effect is likely to be a effect on that particular age group. Effects of on age 18 if it were only raised to 19. Effects on young adults 19 to 20. And then finally, effects on people 21 to 24 if it were raised to 25. All of that, let's look at this so that you have a full display of the estimates. But go back. So those were judgments in terms of small, medium, and large. What the committee then did is to try to quantify that in order to be able to provide an input to the modeling. So considered numeric ranges for each of these descriptors, ranges in increments of 5% to avoid implying unrealistic precision in the estimates. So the ranges are from 5% for small to 30% for large potential changes in initiation, as indicated on the slide. We also, in reaching those judgments, compared available literature with regard to the sizes from other tobacco control policies, and use that as a foundation for thinking about the potential impact of raising the minimum age in light of all the considerations that I mentioned before. It's also important, before talking about the modeling, that the effect sizes reflect the committee's judgment about the effect of an increase on the entire United States because the models are essentially national models. Here, then, is the display now converting small, medium, and large into our judgments about the percentage of decrease in initiation at the relevant ages. With regard to the modeling, then, there are we with David Levy and Ted Holford to model the effects of these changes using both the CISNET and SimSmoke models. They indicate certain aspects of the models themselves. I'll just emphasize that, of course, they refer only to cigarette smoking. The estimates that we are making would be relevant to all tobacco products, but the modeling relates only to cigarettes. Conclusions based on the modeling. So the minimum age of legal access to tobacco products, particularly to ages 21 and 25, will lead to substantial reductions in smoking prevalence. Both models, the models reach different specific numbers, but relatively speaking, they converge and are concordant on the basic conclusions. in terms of the relative increase. They estimate that if the minimum age were raised now, in 2100, and actually when we look at the display that I will show you in a minute, even about 2060, prevalence would decrease above and beyond the decrease that is already projected to occur in the status quo scenario. So based on simply raising the minimum age, that's the only policy change that's fed into the model, it would decrease approximately 3% if the age were raised to 19, 12% if it were raised to 21, and 16% if it were raised to 25. Here is the display so that you can see the figure that records then accounts for what I said earlier about the substantial difference in increasing initiation between 18 and 21, and the relatively smaller increment that you get for raising it to 25. Next, so we have those prevalence figures, and actually another point to be made about the prevalence as well, just to put a human face on it. If we were raised to 21, the 12% decline in initiation by 2060 would represent about 3 million fewer adult smokers by that time. Beyond prevalence to the various health outcome effects, so naturally, raising the minimum age will have will off in terms of improved health outcomes in various ways. We have modeled some specifically, but the committee also reviewed the literature with regard to all the various ways in which there could be improvements on health. And I just want to summarize these busy slides for you to look at later. Raising the will improve the health of adolescents and young adults immediately in various ways by having foregone smoking or stopped in the various ways mentioned in this the slide. There also will be intermediate improvements in health effects averted, including those that have been mentioned here. And of course, with regard to term effects relating to heart disease and cancer, of course, the minimum age will reduce those in the long run as well. Important to emphasize also that the raising the minimum age will reduce exposure to secondhand smoke and the prevalence of other tobacco use, further reducing the associated adverse effects on health, both immediately and over the long term as well. Just to present a couple of specific outcomes that were modeled by the committee. Raising will likely improve maternal, fetal, and infant outcomes by reducing the likelihood of maternal and paternal smoking. So if you were to look at the tables here, and again, I'll just pick out 21 as the illustration, there would be 400,000 fewer babies born with low birth weight, over 250,000 fewer preterm births, and approximately 4,000 fewer SIDS deaths. And these effects obviously would occur sooner than many of the important health outcomes that take some decades to occur, and particularly focus, of course, on the impact on young adults and their families. With the longer-term effects, the minimum age will likely lead to substantial reductions in smoking-related mortality. Of course, as I've indicated, these effects will not be seen for some time, but they are substantial, of course. The CISNET model projected that if the minimum age were raised now to 21 nationwide, For that cohort of young people born between the years 2000 and 2019, and then projected forward, throughout the lifespan of that cohort, there would be approximately 225,000 fewer premature deaths, 50,000 fewer deaths from lung cancer, and more than 4 million fewer years of life loss due to tobacco smoking. In a few words, summary of the findings of the committee. I indicated the committee the task that we were asked to perform in terms of projecting the public health implications of raising the age. Obviously, there are other considerations that policymakers, both federally at some point and at the state and local level, will want to take into account. But the committee did think it would be important to provide some additional observations about the nation of what I have just said and what the committee's findings are into the policy context. Relate to the assumptions that I mentioned earlier that we made, and others to some other factors that need to be taken into account. So, first of all, as I indicated earlier, assume relative stability, intensity of tobacco control activities, and the continuation of minimum age enforcement at existing levels. Naturally, the public health benefits could be greater if tobacco control policies were strengthened and if minimum enforcement were substantially strengthened in light of what I said earlier about the lack of enforcement for non-commercial distribution and on the matter of possession. Those are, of course, controversial issues, but we are, as I said, it's important to emphasize the assumption. It is also the case, of course, that the converse would be true if there's substantial backsliding in connection with tobacco control. It might be that some of these effects might be greater or might be less in relation to raising the minimum age. Second, to emphasize is that the quantitative estimates are based on a national model, and therefore numbers of the kind that we just projected based on the models would assume that there's nationwide change in the minimum age, either because Congress undertook such a change, or if the minimum age were raised in a substantial portion of the nation's in the states with a substantial portion of the nation's population. Over the short term, at least, in the absence of changes of that magnitude, states and localities would have to translate kinds of findings that were set forth in this report into state-by-state estimates. Very important issue in the field, of course, is adolescent development, and so again, just to reiterate a point that emerges from the rapidly developing literature, 18 is not the only developmentally plausible place to set the minimum age, and it actually is maybe not the only necessarily legally plausible age as well, because it's important to understand that the age of majority functions as a default. It sets the legal age for certain activities either higher or lower for different policy purposes. So in some contexts, it's lower than 18, such as authority to consent to certain treatments, and in other contexts, it's set higher, as we're well aware, with regard to alcohol, the minimum age for purchase of alcohol, for marijuana in the states that have done that, and for occupational licensing, for example. And so in this context, state legislators can be expected to draw the line at different places and different policy contexts to take into account the values that need to be balanced in those different contexts. So naturally, a balance does need to be struck between the personal interests of young adults in making their own choices and legitimate concerns about protecting the public health and protecting young people from decisions that they may later regret. A final point in terms of translating this into policy is that Obviously, we're all aware that there is a tremendous ferment, I suppose, in the tobacco landscape, that the introduction of e-cigarettes and other electronic nicotine delivery systems into the market is kind of a wild card here, and the data are simply not available, and were not available for the committee to be able to incorporate any projections with regard to those in which introduction of these products could affect the public health impact of raising the minimum age. On the patterns of end use over time, obviously, and its relationship to cigarette use and to its health effects. So, in the absence of some transformative changes in the tobacco market, in norms and attitudes, or in the epidemiology of tobacco use, the committee is reasonably confident that raising the minimum age will reduce tobacco initiation, particularly among adolescents 15 to 17, will improve health across the lifespan, will save lives. To Dick Corson, who will that you have posed for us.
Excuse me, thank you, Richard. Now we will turn to our Q&A session. As a reminder, you may submit questions in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And so we will go ahead and get started. Our first question is, what should happen as a result of your report regarding the minimum age restriction?
Our action, perhaps judging from the number of attendees to the meeting, which seems to be over 250, that there has been considerable, I think, interest in the possibility of raising the minimum age, and perhaps some pause in legislative activity and consideration awaiting the findings from this report. So I think in that context, we hope and expect that there will be substantial consideration at the state and local level of the findings of this report, as those legislators take into account all the other considerations. What we've tried to move the discussion forward by setting forth what we think to be the likely public health implications of raising the age.
Question is from Como News Service in Seattle. Current and Washington State would make this the first state to enact a statewide 20 smoking age. What would be the national impact and influence of an entire state setting this new minimum age?
Well, my colleagues will have some response to that.
Sure. We always have states learning from each other, and lots of states watch to see what their neighbors are going to do in terms of policy before they the charge themselves. So I think in this policy landscape, it would be interesting to watch an entire state do this, and lots of states would be looking to see what the evaluation data from this policy would show. Perhaps there would be dissemination from there.
Reinforce that point as well. So we have the Laboratory of Federalism at work. I think everyone is awaiting the results from New York City about what they've done, if we had statewide adoption, and if the effects were monitored, as Paula just said. I think that would be of tremendous value to the rest of the states as they're considering this.
Is why would 15 to 17-year-olds be most impacted by potential policy changes regarding the minimum age?
So I'm going to direct this to Robin Mermelstein.
Okay, persons between 15 and 17 have a lot to benefit, and indeed the committee estimates that if the minimum age were raised to 21, initiation rates for this group would be down by 25%, which is a substantial improvement. And the 17-year-olds are an important group, and the effects would be significant in that group for a couple of reasons. These are years where we see the most initial trials with cigarette smoking, and these are also the years where biologically are vulnerable to receiving the benefits in the sense of their brain being most sensitive to the potential rewarding effects of nicotine. So those trials during the 15 to 17-year times may be more likely to escalate to continued use and initiation threshold. The same, kids between 15 and 17 get most of their cigarettes from social sources. And the more distance we put between a 15-year-old and the legal access, the less likely they are to have exposure to smokers, the less likely they are to have access to cigarettes, and the probability they will have access to ongoing sources of cigarettes to move beyond those trials to initiation is much less. 15 to 17-year-olds are prime years for us to intervene, and a positive effect of raising the minimum age to 21 would have a substantial benefit for them.
Next question is, in modeling the outcomes, did you think about the potential greater ease for retailers of administering minimum purchase age laws for tobacco if it were made the same as alcohol? That is there a reason to think that compliance would be better?
We actually did speak about that as one of the factors that might, from an enforcement standpoint, increase efficiency and effective enforcement. As it turned out, in terms of the assumptions that the committee made, we found that the level of enforcement effective for 19, 20-year-olds, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds has been for under 18, which I think just basically equalizes that point. I mean, if we had been worried about enforcement or under enforcement of tobacco age, if it was 21, the enforcement and combining maybe the enforcement responsibility with alcohol, might have had a stronger factor. But actually, given the assumption that we made, and then the projections that we made from that, that turned out, I think, not to be a critical issue. However, of course, I think at the individual state level, a consideration that one would want to take into account, both in terms of efficiency and effectiveness of enforcement. Reactions also to that?
No, I agree with you.
Yeah, okay.
Received a few questions that ask about the policy change compared to other tobacco control efforts. What does the court say about this? About tobacco control efforts?
The effects that we've estimated?
Mm-hmm.
The report, in explaining why we estimated the effects that we did, the effects of other types of tobacco control interventions. We often actually spoke, as I think often people do in this context, about the effects of raising the price and what would be comparative effects in terms of youth initiation, for example, raising the age. So in reaching the consensus judgments that we did, we definitely took into account the literature with regard to other effect sizes. Let me also ask Robin whether she wants to reflect on this question as well.
I think I'll do a direct within the modeling per se, we certainly used our knowledge, the evidence base of what have been the effect sizes with other policies to set boundaries on what our estimated effect sizes would be. So we put sizes well within the context of what has been achieved so that we would not either over or understretch those estimates, but rather they are well within the bounds of what we've known. We also know that tobacco control policies work together, and or that you can get synergistic effects of them when they're all in totality. Those are not results per se that are likely to reflect the more you do, the better the overall outcome. So perhaps our estimates are underestimates of what could be a totality of the picture.
I think you might be wondering how this policy might fare compared to, say, raising tobacco taxes, and that's actually the answer because it would totally depend on the amount of a tax increase. If it's a pack versus 50 cents a pack or a nickel a pack, so that we can't really do that direct kind of comparison. But what Rob said, in the context of the broad array of strategies used to deal with the tobacco problem, I think that's very well and certainly ends up having a much larger impact than I think any kind of educational sort of action that's been tried in the past. The effects are much larger comparatively speaking-based kinds of approaches.
Was there any outcome data on the effects of raising the age from 18 for all that have raised age to either 19 or 21? Was there any outcome data so far the effects that were considered in the conclusions drawn in this report?
Easy to answer. There are no data available with regard to the states that have it at 19, for example, and have had for some years. Secondly, with regard to the few jurisdictions that have raised it to 21, we understand there's research underway in New York City, but no data available at this time. Perhaps there'll be some data that will emerge, in Big Island and in the towns in that have undertaken this. We know there's been those data, but at the present time, there was nothing that the committee had in hand.
Smoking has already gone down, and it's expected that rates will continue to decrease even without a policy change. So why raise the minimum age?
Well, I certainly hope and expect that tobacco control activities will continue at least at the same level of intensity, and that the ongoing trend lines will continue to reduce cigarette ignition and prevalence and all the adverse health effects. But even under the existing projections, there will be tens of millions of people who will be smokers in the 21st century. And as indicated, even if you else other than raise the minimum age, we think that in and of itself, raising it to 21, would reduce the number of adult smokers by 3 million by about 2060, and all of the various adverse health outcomes that are associated with it. And obviously, those are significant public health gains for the nation, and then obviously for the individuals that would be affected. Do you want to add anything to that? I'm all on the same page on that.
Question. Young under the age of 21 who become pregnant have very high smoking rates. Did they include benefits of smoke-free pregnancies in this age group?
One of the models did consider the effects of smoking rates in women and at the reproductive years. So that did explicitly take into account the fact that smoking rates in underage women who get pregnant are higher, and than the potential benefits of the policy. So yes, one. Yeah.
So it did in the data that I showed earlier.
Yeah.
If moms get cigarettes from friends and relatives, how will this policy work?
Of different ways of working. First of all, some of those friends would be underage, and they're all the social sources of anyone underage would be less easily accessible and available. And the networks of young kids who are, say, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, are less likely to include people who are of the legal access age. Right now, with 18 as the age, a 16-year-old may easily come into contact in school with an 18-year-old, but a whole lot less likely to come into contact with somebody who's 21-year-old. So social sources are distant some. Also expect that is in the legal access age reminds people again that smoking is something that is bad for everybody, regardless of age, and social norms will continue to reflect that this is a behavior that's really not good for anyone of age. So we see that even with social sources, that messaging that perhaps this is the stuff to think about this will be there, and youth will be less likely to start smoking.
Thank you. Question: Won't raising the minimum age for legal access to tobacco create a black market for cigarettes?
So we think so. There is maybe kinds that are developing, and certainly with regard to the differential taxation, across the country. And as I indicated, there is a recent report also commissioned by FDA on the development of an or gray market for tobacco products. However, in the committee's judgment as well as this committee's judgment, whatever market is developing of that nature is not likely to be satisfying or is likely be supplying cigarettes to underage youth. And that it's not happening now, and we do not foresee that it will be a substantial factor in the future.
What have we learned from changing the minimum age for alcohol from 18 to 21 that is applicable to tobacco?
Very good question, and the committee also spent some time reflecting on that. I'll say a few things. I think my colleagues may want to add others. One of the first things to say is that the evidence with regard to the impact of both dropping the alcohol age in the wake of the changing age of majority, and then re-raising it later, do demonstrate that the minimum age did have an effect on consumption and on the outcomes related to alcohol consumption by young people. So that's one thing. On the other hand, of course, with alcohol, it's incomplete. There is obvious substantial underage consumption. And in that context, perhaps relevant information, in terms of alcohol could be important with regard to compliance by retailers, with regard to the prohibition against sale to minors, the enforcement of those laws, as well as the availability of social sources and enforcement there. In the context, the enforcement patterns are very, very different for alcohol than they are for tobacco. The committee did, as I indicated earlier, make a conservative judgment that given the big differences in sort of social context and in tradition and practice, that policymakers are unlikely to want to replicate what is happening with regard to alcohol enforcement in this context, or at least that would take a substantial change in practice. So we assumed that the enforcement trends would not resemble they now are for alcohol. If they were, they have an additional effect on the outcomes. But we assumed that would not be the case. One thing that needs to be emphasized is that alcohol, the goal of social policy is completely different with regard to alcohol and tobacco. Robin indicated earlier. With alcohol, the rule is essentially a weight rule. The social objective is not to prevent people from becoming users of alcohol. However, in the context of tobacco, the objective is to prevent people from becoming users of tobacco. And in that context, what Robin said earlier about the social norm plays an increasingly important role. So there's some similarities in thinking about the mechanisms of enforcement, but in terms of the overall social policy objective, there are really huge differences between the two.
Question for today. If this national model, how can states and localities use this information?
Well, at the qualitative level, the overall conclusions, I think the conclusions are directly translatable into action in terms of there will be substantial public health gains by raising at whatever level. Of course, I want to emphasize there are other considerations that need to be taken into account aside from what the public health benefits would be. So I think evidence of being able to quantify these changes, to the extent that states want to try to quantify the possible impact based on what we've said, their experts in public health departments or other, agencies, can take a look at this data and try to extrapolate what might be true in their particular state on levels, current levels of initiation, for example, and so on. So the data, the quantitative information here, modeling may be useful to them. Even in the absence of, quantitative data, I think the qualitative observations and findings are directly applicable.
For questions for today, don't forget you can download a free copy of our report from the National Academies Press at www.napss.edu. Once you edit this webinar, you will be redirected to our report page, which is www.iom.edu/tobacco minimum age. And a copy of the recording and the slides will both be posted on that website within the next week or so. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers and thank you all again for participating in this afternoon's webinar. Have a great day.